Hello everyone. This is Jihyun. 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. And welcome back to Growing Up in Korea, the podcast where we explore how the past shapes the present. These days, we are exploring the development of Korean democracy. And from the outside, Korea's democracy can look incredible, right? I mean, this is a country that's known for holding its presidents accountable, even removing them from office. But it took a very long time and a lot of struggle for Korea to get to where it is today. If you listen to this podcast and read my newsletter called Understanding Korea One Story at a Time, you will get a much clearer picture of how this democracy was actually built. Okay, so let's dive in. Last week, we talked about software of control. We talked about the invisible prison, the national security law that criminalized the thought, the KCIA that enforced the terror, and the anti-communist ideology that made the obedience feel like a patriotism. But laws on paper are one thing. Laws written onto bodies, that's something else entirely. This week, we are talking about the hardware of the garrison state. We are diving into what happened when that architecture of control met daily life. How the garrison state didn't just exist in courtrooms or secret basements. It lived in your muscles, in your documents, in your children's classrooms, and in your neighbors' whispers. The bars were invisible. The locks were everywhere. First, let me take you back to January 1968. It's winter in Seoul, cold, gray. People are going about their lives. Work, school, family dinners. South Korea is still poor, still rebuilding from the war that ended 15 years earlier. In fact, it's desperately poor, so poor that by some estimates, South Korea's per capita GDP is still roughly equal to or even lower than North Korea's. Think about that for a moment. In 1968, it wasn't yet obvious that South Korea would become the economic powerhouse we know today. The miracle hadn't happened yet. People were hungry. Infrastructure was crumbling. The future was uncertain. But there's hope. The economy is starting to grow. Park Chung-hee's government promises development, prosperity, and a better future. And then on January 21st, everything changes. 31 North Korean commandos slip through the mountains. They are wearing South Korean army uniforms. They are carrying automatic weapons. And they are heading straight for the Blue House, South Korea's presidential residence. They get within 800 meters of the Blue House. 800 meters. That's less than half a mile, about 10 city blocks. If you've ever walked from, say Times Square to Bryant Park in New York, or from the White House to the Washington Monument, that's about the same distance. In a city of millions, trained assassins got that close to killing the president. There's a firefight in the streets of Seoul. Ordinary citizens hear gunshots. Police scramble. The military mobilizes. Most of the commandos are killed. A few escape back north. But the damage is done. The message is unmistakable. The war isn't over. The enemy isn't just at the border. The enemy is here. And then, 10 months later, October 1968, another team lands on the East Coast. more than 100 infiltrators. They moved from village to village near Uljin and Samcheok. They killed the civilians. They killed the soldiers. They killed the police officers. The front line, people realize, isn't just at the DMG anymore. The front line is everywhere. So the President Park Chung-hee understood something crucial in that moment. These attacks were terrifying, yes, but they were also useful. They gave him the perfect justification to do something he'd wanted to do for years: build a total system of control. Last week, we talked about the software, the national security law that criminalized thought, the KCIA that enforced terror, the anti-communist ideology that made obedience feel like patriotism. But today, we are talking about the hardware, the physical systems that turned South Korea into what political scientists call a garrison state. And there were three main pieces to this hardware. The first hardware, the reserve army next door. 3 months after the Blue House raid, April 1st, 1968, the National Assembly passed the Homeland Reserve Forces Act. The vote was contagious. A lot of legislators were worried. They said, "Aren't we militarizing civilian life too much? Isn't this going to blur the line between soldier and citizen?" And Park Chung-hee's government basically said, that's exactly the point. Here is how it worked. If you were a man in South Korea and you'd completed your mandatory military service, which was almost every able-bodied male, you were automatically enrolled in the reserve forces for 8 more years. 8 years! Not as a volunteer, not if you felt like it, automatically. 4 years in what they called the Mobilization Reserve Forces, 동원 Yebigun. During those 4 years, you could be called up at any moment to deploy to the front lines. You'd get a notice, sometimes with just days of warning, and you'd have to leave your job, leave your family, and report for duty. Then, another 4 years in the Homeland Reserve Forces, 향토 Yebigun. During this period, you'd train closer to home, but you'd still have to show up for drills, learn to use weapons, practice combat scenarios. By the early 1970s, over 2.5 million men were enrolled in this system. But the state wasn't done. Yebigun only covered men who had finished their military service. What about everyone else? What about men who hadn't served? What about older men? This is where the second piece of this hardware comes in. In 1975, the government added yet another layer, the Civil Defense Corps, known as Minbangwi. The trigger for this was another massive psychological shock, the fall of Saigon in April 1975. For South Korea, this was terrifying. The image of Americans evacuating, of a U.S. ally completely collapsing, it sent a wave of panic through the government. Park Chung-hee's message became blunt. America might not save us. We are on our own. Here's the genius, or the horror, depending on how you look at it, of this system. The Civil Defense Corps covered everyone who didn't qualify for the reserve forces. Men between the ages of 20 and 50 who hadn't served in the military, civil defense. Men who'd completed their 8 years of reserve duty, civil defense until age 50. Even men who are too old or physically unable to serve in the active reserve forces, civil defense. The Framework Act on Civil Defense was enacted on September 22, 1975. And suddenly, the militarization of Korean society was total. The official justification was emergency preparedness, air raid defense, search and rescue, disaster response. But the real fact was that every adult male in the country was now enrolled in some form of paramilitary organization. You finish your mandatory active military service. In the 1960s and 70s, there was 3 years for the army. 3 full years of your life. You think you're done. No. 8 years of reserve forces. Finally done with that. You think you're free? No. Civil defense until you're 50. Here, let me add a quick note. Military service duration has changed over the decades. By the 1990s, it was reduced to around 26 months. By the 2000s, it was down to 24 months. And as of 2025, it's 18 months for the Army and Marine Corps, 20 months for the Navy, and 21 months for the Air Force. But back in the 1970s, you gave the state 3 years of active duty, then another 8 years on standby, and then civil defense until you turned 50. That's over 30 years of your life under some form of military obligation. If the reserve forces Yebigun was the shadow army meant for combat, the Civil Defense Corps Minbangwi was the civil defense machine meant for control. Their job was to manage the home front. They were the ones who enforced the mandatory blackout drills. You've probably seen this in movies. The air raid siren wails, and every single light in the city has to go out. There was Minbangwi patrol, knocking on doors, yelling at you to cover your windows. Every 15th of the month was a Civil Defense Day. The siren would go off, and everyone, in their offices, in their homes, on the street, had to stop what they were doing and practice. They practiced the first aid, firefighting, and post-attack recovery. So by 1975, the system was complete. With Yebigun, every man was a potential soldier. With Minbangwi, every other civilian was a responder. Let me tell you what it felt like back then. The drills were constant. On the 15th of nearly every month, air raid sirens would sound, and everyone had to stop what they were doing and take cover. Streets would empty, traffic would halt, businesses would close their doors. Do you hear the background sound? This is the siren sound I used to hear when I was in Korea, when I was in elementary school. Through the 1980s, these drills happened regularly. You'd be working, suddenly sirens. You'd have to evacuate to designated shelters. Security personnel would check to make sure everyone complied. If you didn't participate, you pay fines and potentially arrested. And the training wasn't just symbolic. Civil defense members learned firefighting, first aid, evacuation procedures, how to identify suspicious persons, how to report potential subversives to authorities. In other words, the state was training every adult male to be both a soldier and an informant. By 1990, there were over 3.5 million people enrolled in civil defense. Think about what that means. That's not standing army. That's a shadow army. Millions of men living civilian lives on the surface, but always on standby. You are working at a factory. You get a notice. You report for training. You spend a week crawling through mud, firing rifles, preparing for an invasion that might happen this afternoon. Then you go back to the factory. You are a teacher. You get called out. You leave your students. You practice guerrilla tactics in the mountains. Then you come back and teach math. You are 45 years old, working as a shopkeeper. The air raid sirens sound on the 15th. You drop everything, evacuate to a shelter, practice emergency procedures, then you go back to selling groceries. The message was unmistakable. There is no such thing as a civilian anymore. You are always a soldier. This system served two purposes. Militarily, it created a massive defense force that could be mobilized instantly. But politically, it was brilliant. It kept every man in a state of permanent readiness. It reinforced the hierarchy. It normalized military authority in every workplace, every neighborhood, every family. South Korea had become a nation where the line between military and civilian life simply dissolved. Now, here's where the story gets interesting and where you can see how democratization slowly chipped away at the garrison state. For decades, this system stayed largely intact. But as South Korea democratized in the late 1980s and 90s, people started asking, do we really need this anymore? And gradually, very gradually, the system changed. Over time, reforms lowered the upper age to 40 and lightened the routine. So now, civil defense obligations would end at age 40, not age 50. Think about what that meant. An entire decade of someone's life, from 40 to 50, suddenly freed from mandatory drills and training. The justification was practical. South Korea's military had become far more technologically advanced. The Defense Reform 2020 plan, initiated in 2005 under President Hyun, aimed to create a smaller, more professional, technology-intensive military rather than relying on mass mobilization. If you are building a high-tech military, you don't need millions of 45-year-olds practicing air raid drills. You need specialists, professional soldiers, advanced equipment. The monthly civil defense drills were also eventually shortened to about 15 to 20 minutes. And today, civil defense still exists. Men are still automatically enrolled from age 20 to 40. They still have to complete training sessions 3 per year. Air raid drills still happen, though they are far less frequent and intense than in the 1970s and 80s. But the feeling has changed. It's no longer this overwhelming, ever-present military atmosphere. It's become bureaucratic, routine, something people complain about having to do, rather than something that shapes their entire worldview. In 2017, the Seattle Times ran an article titled South Korea's Once Rigorous Civilian Air Raid Drills Grow Lax. It described how younger Koreans often don't take the drills seriously anymore. They see them as a relic of an older, more paranoid era. And that shift from fear-driven vigilance to bureaucratic inconvenience tells you everything about how South Korea has changed. The legal structure is still there. The system still exists, but the meaning has transformed. That's what happens when a garrison state slowly, painfully learns to breathe again. So the state conscripted the man. The next logical step? Conscript young people. And this makes the second hardware, Gyoryeon, military training in school. Picture a high school in 1969. It's a Monday morning, the bell rings, boys file onto the field wearing olive green uniforms. They are carrying plastic rifles. Not real ones, but weighted replicas. They are learning how to march in formation, how to throw grenades, how to crawl under barbed wire. Girls are kneeling on the ground. They are practicing first aid. They are learning how to apply pressure bandages, how to perform CPR, how to evacuate the wounded during an air raid. The teacher? Often a reserve military officer, not a regular educator. The subject is Gyoryeon, military training. And it's not optional. This is not PE class. This is mandatory military preparedness training for every high school student in the country. Gyoryeon normalized the idea that your childhood was temporary, that your life as a student was just a waiting period before you became a soldier. It taught you that learning to think critically, to question, to imagine, all of that was secondary to learning to obey. I never had to take this class. It was abolished by the time I was in school, and I attended a high school in Bangkok, Thailand anyway. But Jihyun, my collaborator on this Substack, did take Gyoryeon. She remembers it vividly. The class for girls was taught by a former nurse, so they learned how to apply compression bandages and perform CPR. But it was still deeply militaristic. She recalls these grueling physical drills like a Samcheok. Samcheok is this notorious first come, first served punishment drill. The instructor yells, "The first 5 to run to that wall and back pass. Everyone else run again." It's a pure brutal tool of physical domination and hierarchy. And this was happening in high school class. But Jihyun's experience was relatively mild. The real brutal phase of Gyoryeon was in the boys' schools, especially the technical high school called Gonggo. Jihyun actually drew a cartoon about the era based on her own experiences and what her friends went through. I put the link of this webtoon on the episode note. You will see these stories are really brutal. In many of these schools, the Gyoryeon teacher was the dean of students, the head of discipline, and he was almost universally a figure of absolute terror. He was often retired special forces soldier, and he ran the school like a military camp. He would walk the halls with a wooden bat or billiards cue. He would beat students for having their hair too long, for their uniforms being impure, or for questioning him. This wasn't discipline. This was violence, plain and simple, normalized under the guise of training. And in some private high schools, Gyoryeon class was used for free labor. There is a 2011 news article that quotes a man who attended high school in the 1970s. He said, and I'm translating here, "In Gyoryeon class, we didn't just get training. We were mobilized to build the school walls, carry bricks for the annex building, and even dig ponds for the school garden." Think about that. The state creates a mandatory class, installs a military figure with total authority, and then uses that authority to turn students into unpaid construction crew. This system continued into university. For male freshmen, your first week of college was an orientation. It was a mandatory training camp run by the army. You'd report to a base, get your head shaved, change into uniform, and undergo intensive drills. The message was unmistakable. You're not here to think, you're here to obey. Gyoryeon taught two things: hierarchy and obedience. It drilled into teenagers the reflex of instant, unquestioning obedience to authority. As scholars have noted, the borderline of the DMG was brought into the home and the classroom. The state was inoculating its future citizens with a military ethos, ensuring the next generation would be perfectly adapted to life in the garrison state. Okay, so now we have a system where every man is a soldier and every teenager is being trained to be a soldier. But how do you keep track of everyone? How do you make sure no North Korean spies slip through? How do you monitor dissent? How do you know who's where doing what at all times? Simple. You give everyone a number. And here comes the third hardware, the National ID System. It's called 주민등록번호 System. In November 1968, just 10 months after the Blue House raid, the South Korean government rolled out a new system, the Resident Registration Number. Initially, it was a 12-digit number. Every citizen over 18 got one. Later, in 1975, they refined it into the current 13-digit format we still use today. Your resident registration number included your birth date, your gender, and your reason of origin. And it was linked to a central government database. The official reason? National security. How do you identify North Korean spies? The government asked. Simple. Give every legitimate citizen a number. Anyone without one is automatically suspect. But here is what it actually became. A surveillance architecture. Want to move to a new city? Report your resident registration number. Get a new job? Your employer needs it. Enroll your child in school? They need it. Open a bank account? Buy a train ticket? Register to vote? You need that number. The number became the key to participating in society. And every time you used it, the state knew where you lived, where you worked, where your children went to school, whom you associated with. This wasn't surveillance in the abstract, theoretical sense. This was embodied surveillance, a number tattooed onto your identity, linking every major life event to a database the state could access at will. And here's the thing. Korea still has this system today. South Korea's resident registration number remains one of the most comprehensive citizen tracking architectures in the democratic world. It's changed, yes. There are more privacy protections now. But the basic structure, the basic idea that every citizen should be permanently numbered and tracked, that was born in 1968 out of the panic following the Blue House raid. And we still have it. So let's take a step back. By the early 1970s, Park Chung-hee's government had built a complete system of control. The software, the national security law, defined dissent as treason. The enforcer, the KCIA, punished dissent with terror. The ideology, anti-communism, made obedience feel like patriotism. And now the hardware. Reserve forces, Yebigun, and Civil Defense Corps Minbangwi turned all men into soldiers. The military training in school, Gyoryeon, trained all children to be soldiers. The national ID card, 주민등록증, tracked everyone like soldiers. This is what the pro-democracy activists of the 1970s and 80s were up against. They weren't just fighting a bad president. They weren't just fighting a corrupt government. They were fighting an entire interlocking system, a society built for total war, a society where every citizen was watched, counted, and conscripted. But here is the thing that's so important to understand. This fortress was built on a lie. The lie was that all this control was necessary to protect the people. Yes, North Korea was a threat. Yes, the Blue House raid was real. Yes, the infiltrations happened. But did that justify turning an entire population into a permanent military reserve? Did that justify militarizing childhood? Did that justify tracking every citizen's movements for their entire lives? The state said yes. The state said this is the price of security. But what they were really building was a system where questioning authority became impossible, where trust eroded, where neighbors watched neighbors, where even children learned to self-censor before they learned to think critically. That's not security. That's control masquerading as security. Now I want to end on a note that's complicated. Because this story doesn't have a simple ending. Democratization came in the late 1980s. The June 1987 uprising forced major changes. University-level military training ended in 1988. High school Gyoryeon was gradually reduced, renamed, and eventually retired. Courts and truth commissions started revisiting past abuses. The worst excesses of the garrison state was dismantled. But not all of it. The resident registration number system? Still there. The reserve forces? Still there. Though training requirements have been scaled back. And perhaps most significantly, the habits of the garrison state, the reflexive deference to authority, the equation of security with control, the normalization of surveillance, those took generations to fade. Some would argue they haven't faded at all. They've just transformed, adapted to new technologies and new threats. So why does this matter? Why am I talking about something that happened 50 years ago? Because understanding this history is crucial to understanding Korean democracy today. Democracy isn't just about having elections. South Korea held elections throughout the Park Chung-hee era. They were often rigged, yes, but they happened. What made the country authoritarian wasn't the absence of voting. It was the presence of this total system of control, a system where every male body could be conscripted, every citizen tracked by number, every child trained to obey without question. Democracy required dismantling the system, not just changing leaders, not just rewriting laws, but fundamentally reshaping the relationship between state and citizen, reclaiming the right to be civilian, to be uncounted, to question authority, to live without the state's constant gaze. That work took decades, and in some ways, it's still ongoing. If you want to see Jihyun's graphic novel, her powerful visual telling of this era, I'll put a link in the show notes. It's in Korean, but even if you can read the language, the images tell a story that words alone cannot capture. And if you want to read the full written essay this episode is based on, with photos and more details, head over to my newsletter, Growing Up in Korea. You can find the link at the episode note as well. Thanks for listening. And if you have family stories from this era or memories you'd like to share, send me a message. History lives in what we remember together. Thank you so much for listening. I hope to see you next week. Bye.